Welcome everyone to the Why Not Informix session. You know, as someone who's been around Informix as long as I have, that's usually sometimes the easier question to answer because it is such a strong technology. But I wanted to dive into this a little bit more in the, let's say, 35 to 45 minutes we have together. But as a housekeeping item, I do want to highlight again that you can decide how you want to listen to this. And anytime during the presentation, you could decide to either hang up your phone and just listen to the audio over your laptop or computer, or vice versa. It's really up to you. If you could use the little bubble on the right-hand side so you can ask questions, and I will look to answer those at the end of the webcast. I am recording this webcast, so if anyone would like the recording or watch it later, I am looking to make that publicly available. And I do want to highlight that if you would like a copy of these slides, don't hesitate to ask, and I will also email those out as well. As a point of introduction, for those of you who do not know me, there are some of you who do and some of you who do not, but my history goes back a long way. In fact, my first time touching Informix was back when AT&T had a chance of being the superpower in computing when they had this machine called a 3v2 series out. In fact, I know I'm getting old when I Google search for 3v2-600, and the first picture that came up was showing a picture of one in a museum. So you know you're getting to a certain point in your life where there's things that you did in your past that are now showing up in museums. After my time in information technology, I went to work for Informix in Dallas, Texas, and moved my way up into being more of a product evangelist and into marketing for reasons outside of my own control. After working at Essential and coming into IBM through the pilot acquisition here in fact, it's been over 6 years now, I rejoined the Informix family here 2 years ago. So I've seen Informix for a long time. I'll be the first one to say I'm a bit of an Informix bigot, so I think Unix bigot. So anyone who wants for me to compare and contrast Unix versus Windows, I will give you a very one-sided answer. And so I wanted to at least give you that background as a point of introduction of who I am as both a presenter and my job within IBM. So my challenge to you today, as the title states, is why not Informix? So I wanted to review the market a little bit, get in mapping some of the capabilities within Informix, I think, in what the market is requiring of an information technology solution. And then kind of bring that home. Because in the end, if I'm not helping you or your organization either make money or save money, it really doesn't matter. And for those of you who are on some of the Informix LinkedIn groups, there's been a lively rant around my promoting of this webcast on the LinkedIn site, so I always appreciate a good rant as it relates to this topic, because I think it is a very passionate way of getting into talking about a technology. But let's talk about the marketplace itself. So as my, the reason I want to introduce myself the way I did is so you get an idea of my background and my length of time around the market, because it is interesting as I see kind of Moore's Law making it to where our issues are not as much around technology holding us back as it is our own desires to figure out how to use it. I think we're at that point. So we have more of a variety of data now. We have more of a greater velocity of data, so the speed which is coming at us is greater. We have larger volumes of data. It is interesting as I see some of the more sensor-based or machine-generated data, how the velocity and the volume of the stuff coming at us is just absolutely exploding. And no matter what anybody says about information, you will always have this same garbage in, garbage out problem. I'm a data snob. I like to look at data, and if for some reason I see errors in the data, I want to fix the data, because if I don't fix it coming in, I know that however I try to sum it up or do some analysis against it at the other end will be even worse. So my ability to make decisions on data, in my mind, are very much about the veracity or the cleanliness of that data as well. And as time has gone on, I have seen a greater complexity of queries, all the way back to, my youth when I was doing executive information systems, which is what we used to call it before data warehousing. If we had a join that had more than 3 or 4 tables in it, we were scared to death because we felt it would take all afternoon to run. So the queries themselves that we see running are becoming more and more complicated. I had a customer print out a query and show it to me in a meeting a couple of weeks ago, where it was a couple of pages long and he taped it together so we could see it together what it was doing. And when it takes multiple pages of paper to print out a single query going to Informix, that creates some complexities. And then he told me the problem isn't the query itself, because Informix can handle the query, and he even showed the query pass. That was another 8 pages of printout. But it was how he has more and more people wanting to ask these queries against more and more real-time data. So we see this morphing of our transactional data and all the way the data is coming in with our needs to both report on it and also do more data analysis, data warehousing, business intelligence, whatever moniker you want to give, in my mind, what I call just ugly queries. And then as time has gone on, there's still one constant in all of this, which is we still have what I call the typical needs of 100% uptime and a database that is still ACID. So ACID is a term that I think has sometimes gotten lost because we just assume information technologies have all these things, but that the ability of being constant and isolated and durable, and as I sometimes look at it, is what if somebody unplugs the box? What happens when you plug it back in again? And oh, by the way, I'm still waiting to meet with a customer whose IT budget or whose ability to spend money has gone up. And I sometimes blame Moore's Law for this. It is interesting to me because I like to go out there and see how much computing power I can buy for the dollar. The processor, the memory, the network speed, and the storage. Not just the capacity of the storage, but the speed of the storage. And when I go out there and see how much I can buy for how little money today, again, the issue isn't my ability to go get hardware that's fast enough. My ability now is to figure out kind of the top 80% of this presentation slide, the dealing with the data and the queries, and I have more and more people asking these complicated questions against more real-time data sets. So that, to me, is where the market is and where we're evolving. In some cases, we may look at variety of data, meaning things like big data. Big data to me is almost like what customer relationship management was 10 years ago, or what data warehousing was in the earlier part of the millennium, where if I lined up 10 different people and asked them what they thought big data is today, I think I get 10 different answers. So there is a component of big data that Informix is ripe to solving. I would never tell you that Informix is here to take on Hadoop or to do, those types of things around, figuring out how a movie is going to do at a movie theater by doing sediment of the marketplace and the social media aspects of things. That's a very different animal when it comes to big data, and that to me is a subset of big data. But to me, there's a whole other degree of big data that we'll get into later in the presentation. Now, my point in getting into why not Informix isn't just about solving your problems up to now, but also looking at the next problems that are coming out as well. So, to me, the challenge is, why not Informix? So I wanted to go through a little bit of history and get into some things that I've coined here about a year ago around Informix in terms of what it can do always. Always being on, always being smart, always being flexible and palatable to your requirements, and also being safe. It's interesting, as someone who in the last 6 months has had his identity stolen, how safety becomes a whole other animal once it's happened to you. And every time I read of a scenario where organizations have worked really hard to do some of these other things around being on and smart and flexible, and suddenly you have 100,000 credit card numbers get stolen, you always want to make sure there's the safety aspect of this. And I think some of that falls back on, how we're looking to be ACID and always, and being a system that is 100% on all the time. So For a point of history around Informix, for those of you who may or may not know this about Informix, it has been around, the technology, a long time. So as someone who joined Informix in 1995, in fact, there's that ominous day in April of 1995 when I joined Informix, that's when version 7.10.UC1 came out, the very first version of 7. That was when the memory grant manager was first in there, and there was, really taking the market to a whole new level with a newly architected database. And it was there to really change how organizations could take advantage of these new things called symmetric multiprocessing machines, which, oh, by the way, my smartphone has 2 cores in it, so even my phone now is a symmetric multiprocessing phone. But back then, you had companies like Sequent and Pyramid who were coming out with these things, and it was completely changing what people could do with open systems hardware. But yet databases or a lot of technology was not written for these multi-threaded or multi-processing environments, and that's where Informix really has its roots in knowing how to do that very well. And as time went on, the company bought a company called Illustra, which brought Dr. Stonebreaker into the mix. And for those of you who know Stonebreaker or know of his story, he is, to this day still, one of the top thought leaders when it comes to information technologies. As a Berkeley professor, he founded Ingress and created Postgres, and out of that came into Informix through the Illustra acquisition to really take database technologies to the new level, to do new data types or non-traditional data types within a database. And some of that will come into play here in this presentation. Not long after that, Informix came out with version 9. After that, in 2001, in fact, I believe it's 11 years ago and a little bit more, is when IBM bought Informix. Through that iterations, version 10 came out, version 11 came out with version 11.1 and 11.50. And then we have, a little over 2 years ago, where 1170 came out. In fact, it was at IOD 2 years ago, if I remember correctly. And that brought hundreds of new capabilities. I mean, some of these capabilities were things I remember asking for when I worked for Informix back in the 90s. And for those of you who may or may not know, the latest iteration of that was just released a couple of weeks ago, 1170. We call it XC6. So if it's 64-bit, that X is an F. If it's for 32-bit Windows, it's a T, and so on. And I created a little quick link here for you to go and get more information about 1170. So if you go to that bit.ly address, you can learn more. You can also just Google search Informix 1170, and you'll find the information center for it. I do want to highlight that the next big release is coming out, and I use the generic phrase of end of March, whether that is March, as a moniker in describing to you when the next big release is coming out. The reason I want to highlight that is there is a lot of activity around Informix. There's a lot of engineering and product management and a lot of work we're doing to bring Informix into continuing those incremental steps and helping you do what's next. So let's continue on with our agenda here around why not Informix. So let's start with, did you know? So some of these I am very, very closely engaged with because in my job I talk to customers anywhere between, in some cases, 3 to 5 times a day. So I have a very close understanding and relationship with a lot of our customers, both from the very smallest to the very biggest. And so some of these is almost like trivia pursuit is, did you know that almost every major hotel reservation system runs on Informix? In fact, all but one in North America runs on Informix. That there is, and this is one of my favorite stories, is one of the major airlines, their fleet management system. So fleet management system in the airline industry is what keeps planes flying. What gate is it coming into? What time does it arrive? Once it arrives, how much water do I put on? How much fuel do I put on? How much baggage is coming off? How much baggage is putting on? All the things that go into allowing that plane to back out of that gate and leave again. And on a bad day for this particular airline, and when I mean bad day, it's like a storm is going through its hub airport. This particular system, because it is directly linked to their website or any other source to figure out when is my plane arriving or leaving, is being hit with over 600 million SQL statements a day. Now, in 2012, as we roll into 2013, some people may not think that's a lot, But what I think is interesting about this is they're doing it on a 4-core Linux environment that's on VMware. So if you're looking for kind of a cost per query math or efficiency in operation, and also looking at fast, this is very much all of these things. And oh, by the way, when I say always on, if this system goes down, planes don't fly. They may fly for a little while. The ones in the air may fly and come in for a landing, but they still need a gate to go to and a delivery window to go to. So this is, my best example of on and fast, but also on and fast very, very inexpensively. Did you know that a majority of all credit card transactions are cleared through Informix? In fact, there's one system at one organization where they average 2,000 transactions a second on one of their boxes. Did you know if you bank with Wells Fargo or Bank of America and you go to online banking, you are touching in some form, fit, or fashion Informix? Did you know at one of the world's largest retailers, they average at any one time 2 active DBAs for over 15,000 instances of Informix? Now, one of the ways I like to put that as an interesting metric is that means that each machine averages 16 minutes of time dedicated to it a year to keep running. So if you want always on, that is a great example of not just always on, but always on with a minimal amount of administrative overhead. So that means that these folks who are working for this retailer can focus more on what is needed next for there and not just keeping the lights on. I thought it was interesting when I read a Gartner report here just last week that talked about the swings in IT budget spend over the last 10 years have moved away from developing and more towards administration, and how that needs to swing back for organizations to figure out what they can do to be different in this ever-changing world. Informix is thinking about that within the engineering organization and how you can focus more on what your organization needs next out of Informix versus worrying about how to keep just the lights on. And then how the world's largest network computing company embeds Informix in over 25 different products and has shipped millions of machines with Informix embedded in it over the last, let's say, 3 to 4 years. So this is an example of always on, always fast. So if I think about back in the 90s, in fact, there were a fair number of people who worked for Informix who used to work for Tandem back in the 90s. And Tandem was a phenomenal success story because they had nonstop SQL and they had all this ability to really show to clients how they can put in an environment that would never go down. You were spending a lot of money for always-on technology, 100% on time, guaranteed. Well, as Moore's Law has brought to us and as time has gone on, and as we've evolved the technology of Informix, you can now do that with Informix. You really, really can. You have rolling upgrades. You have all these things we do to allow you to adjust Informix as, using my airline example before, is adjust it while it's in the air. Change the direction, tune what you're doing, adjust, and make changes as it makes sense, and more importantly, even have the database automatically make those decisions based on how you set up your KPIs, your key metrics on how you want it to act. And you can do, as I say here, auto everything. It can provision disk, it can defrag disk, it can go out there and even auto provision additional CPU VPs on demand. And oh, by the way, do it on the cheap. You can do this on a Linux platform. You could do it on an Apple platform. You could do it on a Windows platform. You can also do it, with any platform you really, really want. So you get all of this ability to replicate and auto-tune and have a system that's always on with Informix and have it to where if one of those machines either in an unscheduled situation goes down, you reroute those users to a different box, or if you have a scheduled downtime for like a rolling upgrade, you need to apply an OS patch, you can do that as well. And I came up with this slide here, a few months back, and as I was coming up with it, I noticed the number of occasions, and in fact, some of these descriptions came out of the release notes or the user's guide for Informix, how often some derivative of the word automatic shows up. It can automatically time out idle users. It will automatically provision storage. You can optimize the number of CPU VPs you have running. And Informix has always automatically gone out there and grabbed more memory than it needed to. So as you see all these different ways in which it will heal, configure, and maintain itself, you truly do have an environment where you can put Informix in autopilot mode. In fact, that is something that I was discussing with some people at IOD, the Information on Demand conference in Las Vegas a few weeks back, and I said, are we not to the point now with Informix where we could honestly add some capabilities to where, just like on an airplane, you can put it in autopilot mode, which you can do today. You can go in there and you can adjust on-config parameters on the fly. You can configure and manage and defrag and do all the things you need to around your disk on the fly. Memory's already managed on the fly. You can go and even grab the memory back with on mode -F if you have to. Well, I'm dating myself quoting some of these on mode commands, aren't I? So you can see where there's so many things you can do now with Informix to literally put it in autopilot mode. But that is for a single machine. What about if for some reason that machine goes down, either by design, by schedule, or by a failure? How do you handle that? Well, there's all kinds of new ways with replication. In fact, it was interesting when I met with a client just yesterday, is he did not know that HDR can now be bidirectional. So you can now make it to where each ends of the cluster can talk to each other. So it's not that I'm doing a high availability cluster anymore, high availability replication. I'm actually doing a synced cluster. Now, I hate to mention companies like O that ends with Ruckle, but you know their rack story has been that for a long time, but it's still a pain in the behind to really run. This is something that can run and have minimal overhead and be very easy for you to provision. And oh, by the way, with all these different replication options, you can read these as well as I can. In fact, I would bet a few of you on this webcast know these very well already. You can also, with 11.7 or the latest versions, make it where it's not just replicating data, it's replicating changes in your application. So if for some reason you do a create statement or an alter table statement or you need to drop something, you can have that propagate out to the rest of your cluster. And oh, by the way, you can also mix and match what you're doing. So it's not like each one of these replication options to keep your system up and running and have it be fast are exclusive of each other. They are inclusive of each other. So they can be a combination of things. So you can have an HDR pair with an RSS secondary, and you can then have flexible grid throwing data out to your stores or to your distribution centers or some other machines. But to my point on a previous slide, where we also need to make sure in this world of safety and security that all of this data is also encrypted. So I want to highlight that because you can also have instances, maybe not within your network it's a problem, but also within, maybe you're replicating out to, dare I say, the cloud. So the cloud could mean a lot of things because I think just as I described big data as kind of different things to different people, the cloud is also kind of different to all of us. But my definition of a cloud in this instance is something that may exist outside of your firewall that you need to replicate data to or you're backing up data to. So to be able to have this always on and have some reference to the cloud be part of that is just as applicable within Informix as well. This is, to me, not a picture that is for you to look at too closely, but an example of a network topography and server topography that I have of a client that is using replication in all kinds of different form, fits, or fashion, so they have absolutely zero points of failure. And oh, by the way, some of these references to a machine in these pictures are actually VMwared instances on the same machine. So maybe they have an HDR pair in their data center. It's two VMwares in a box, but then they also have a different physical box within that same data center that they replicate to. And then they have some secondary in some other data center that's got a slower network bandwidth. They're using RSS, so they can mix synchronous and asynchronous, so they have zero chances of downtime. Zero. And oh, by the way, one of the things I loved about Informix is we could do it, and I hate to use the word cheap, but how about value-driven? So I talk, you know, the 2012 is the marketing monikers of V's, value, velocity, veracity, and so on. One of the things I want to highlight here that I believe on the LinkedIn rant about this webcast, Doug Daly brought up is kind of a new V, which is value. Because to my point, nobody's IT budget is growing. So how am I either going to help you save money or make money is very important. So when it comes to being always on, you can truly have 100% uptime with Informix. Rolling upgrades, a mixed use on the box, and also mixed use between boxes. So I think one of the big drivers of people using replication today outside of high availability is also their ability to say, you know what, I have box A, and box A is my transaction system, and I'm worried about high availability. But another thing I'm worried about is box A is my business. Box A is also where I have more and more kind of corporate users wanting to ask uglier questions. So I need to offload those to box B. So maybe what I do is I set up an HDR pair, and I have box B over here, and I actually create this wall between my transaction environment and my corporate users asking, you know, BI queries or reporting queries on the fly, and they want that real-time data. So they can have real-time data as an operational cluster to get that net result. But more importantly, if for some reason one of those boxes go down, I can have and still have 100% uptime. I can reroute those users to the other box. And oh, by the way, I can do it cheaply and I can do it easily. So other areas of always on, I've kind of highlighted a lot of these things. And again, for some of you who've been around Informix for a long time, some of these are kind of second nature to you, but there's ones I always like to mention because they kind of get lost in the noise. Your ability to alter tables on and alter fragments on demand for a really, really big table. For you to be able to disconnect, in fact, one of the best ways I found to increase performance and availability and minimize I/O constraint is just move your indexes to a different DB space. And then finally, you know, with 1170, to me, the final end game here in terms of on-the-fly configuration is your ability to change any on-config parameter with the on mode statement. Again, doing all of this while the database is running. So why not Informix? So can other database technologies allow you to dynamically tune and or have the database self-tune itself and keep it running while you're doing it and allow you to do rolling upgrades and allow you to do it across operating systems and allow you to focus on the business? Because it is amazing, as someone who's been around information technology as long as I have, how is it in 2012, as it is almost 2013, databases as a whole are still such a pain in the behind? Ask yourself that. If you know, other things that have been around for 30 years, are they still this much of a pain? So that is always on and to a certain degree always fast. Let's talk about always smart. So did you know in fact, it's one of the world's largest truck manufacturers enables their supply chain using Oracle's OBIEE tool. And for those of you who don't know what that is Oracle's Business Intelligence Enterprise Edition tool. I believe it was originally a Siebel product on Informix, and it uses Informix parallel capabilities. And I put in here, despite Oracle being the tool, because we all know there's no lost love in Redwood Shores for anything with Informix attached to it. But yet we are able to transparently enable this portal that's enabled through OBIEE to use Informix because of the transparency of doing a lot of the intelligence, or as I say, always smart capabilities. Or another example where I have in-cap analysis at a retailer. So in-caps, for those of you who are, you know, shoppers like I am, you have an in-cap where you buy a Diet Coke 4 for $10. Or next week it is 3 for $12. And the next weekend for that it's a different price. So they want to change features and end caps all the time. And store managers need to be able to be smarter in how they analyze their end caps because that can drive significant revenue and margins for those stores. So how do you analyze that? And by the way, these are ugly queries. So I keep using the word ugly because I can't think of a better way of describing business intelligence, data warehousing, predictive analytics, or executive information systems in a really easy way besides saying these are ugly queries against the database. And how do you do that for a large number of concurrent users? I think it's interesting as we look at databases and how we all try to be smarter, how we are challenged not with processing queries, because I think you can always back up the truck, roll in an appliance, and plug it in to process a query really fast. But that's one query. How do I deal with high concurrency? How do I deal with 1,000 store managers, 2,000 store managers asking different flavors of a query at the same time and still give them a response time that is reasonable? Or how do I do it for court analysis here where they have 40 years worth of data, but in this case they have 6 different tools asking all kinds of different queries. So I don't have just one type of tool sending me a query I can predict. I have a whole lot of OLAP tools and crystal reports and Excel and, you know, a very heterogeneous tool set over the top of me asking me queries that I have to be able to respond to quickly despite what the tool is. So these are examples where Informix is still very actively used today and growing. Now, again, I think something that gets lost with Informix that has been part of the database a long time is ever since this edition that came out, this version that came out, my apologies, 17 years ago, sorry, I had to take a pause there to think 17 years ago, allowed you to do fragmenting of the table and your detaching of indexes and your ability to have this memory grant manager that could take a query and parallelize it, you know, almost magically, despite the tool, has been part of the database. And over time, we have been evolving this capability and maturing it so it's even better and smarter and easier for you to enable for you or your customers. And then along came the Warehouse Accelerator. I think it is, to me, one of the most exciting technologies that really only IBM was able to wrap themselves around. It was originally out of the Blink project. So if anyone has not seen the video, I'll put the URL up here shortly, of Guy Lohman talking about what Blink is from the labs of San Jose. To be able to take all your data, bring it into memory, compress it, columnarize it, and make it to where we can truly change how queries are optimized and solved for you. And it really does bring this unprecedented ability to perform queries at the speed of light. In fact, I was doing some math where current memory performance speeds are seek times of 8 nanoseconds. Now let's put that in perspective. The speed of light in 8 nanoseconds is 9 feet. 9 feet? 9 feet. 9 feet is how far light travels in 8 nanoseconds. I am able to work on accessing data at what I would consider the speed of light for this Warehouse Accelerator. And I'm also doing it transparently to the query itself. And I'm also doing it in a way in which I am simplifying what I'm doing in memory and make it to where there's literally no tunable parameters to the thing. And I'm sure a lot of you have seen this picture, and if you haven't, it really is a summation of what the Warehouse Accelerator can do. And I'm not going to bore you with this. I would just recommend that you think about how you can, without replumbing your application environment and how you run queries, and how you need to do this really on the cheap and transparently to your application, how you, in this example, can go from, I believe, 98 minutes to 24 seconds. Or for this very large retailer who was, in fact, comparing Informix to Teradata, is on one inexpensive Linux box, blowing the socks off what they need to do for performance times. Really making it to where you can think differently of your data and have a conversation with the data. So I recommend you to go check out, this is the short URL I created, so you can go to YouTube and see Guy Lohman's video on what the Warehouse Accelerator is and how it can make a difference for you on commodity hardware. In fact, did you know you can go out to the internet and buy a machine with a terabyte of RAM in it for under $40,000? That, to me, is unbelievable. And if you consider in the Warehouse Accelerator that we get anywhere up to 5-to-1 compression on data, and the only thing in memory is the data, that means that I am, in a very inexpensive box, able to crank through 5 terabytes of data very, very quickly, in fact, at the speed of light. So why not Informix? No other database can parallelize a query transparently, in some cases to spite the application tool, and allow you to easily reduce any disk I/O you may have through table partitioning. And oh, by the way, make it easy for you to implement either upon initialization of the data or once you've thrown the data in there to make changes to the data. So implement or change on the fly. And then with the Warehouse Accelerator, to be able to implement kind of an in-memory columnar extension to combat what I consider the ugliest of queries, your star schemas in new ways. Because what you're really solving with the IWA is, you know, a query has four subsets. You're searching for records, so you're doing a scan. You are joining, you're aggregating, and you're sorting. Those are the four primary things that happen. Yeah, there's some math you may do, and there was summations or whatever, but those are the four things. You can always try to figure out how to use a buffer cache to do the first one, right, to scan the data faster. But those last three become painful. They become very solvable very quickly when you columnarize it in memory with IWA. And then also make it all tightly coupled in one product. Because you can go out there and buy, you know, another database that starts with an O and ends with RUCL, but it's going to be all kinds of bit parts and pieces you have to buy and wire together. And it's not near as efficient. So to put this all together in one environment is what really makes Informix different. How about flexible? So we're here at about 37 minutes into the presentation, so I'll try to end this quickly, so if anyone has any questions. So as I mentioned before, when Informix bought Illustra, part of what they were looking to do there is to make it to where the database wasn't just handling your typical numbers and letters and dates, because those are all very simple data types. You know, what about other types of data types, either that you extend the database to do or that you want to extend it to do? So this, to me, is probably the wordiest slide I've ever put together in my life, so my apologies, but my point here, I think, is well summarized by a presentation given at the Informix Users Conference 12 years ago. And I think my point in putting this quote out here is the fact that 12 years ago there were very few organizations who thought this way because the needs were not there yet for the technology. But Brad Jensen, then the Vice President of American Airlines, who was they had put in this very interesting data warehouse, data refinery they called it. He says, think what I can do now. My developers, by plugging in C code in the database as a user-defined routine, my developers know nothing about multi-threaded or parallelism of what they're trying to do. They just know the business logic. And once you put it into Informix, closest to the data, Informix can now make that a multi-threaded operation and parallelize it with no magic on my developer's part. So major routines can run in minutes or seconds. It took hours. So you're really taking the business logic that would sit on top of the database that would take the data, suck it out of Informix, crank through it, probably put it back in again for something else to happen, and you put it down within the database, and now it's really a simple function call by a SQL statement. So now within Informix, if you knew this or not, with 1170 released 2 years ago, you get all of these database extensions with it. So there were some that have been pre-wrapped for you around dealing with text search and time series data and spatial data and so on. These now come with an Informix, and they allow you to parallelize and back up and do all kinds of other things with this data type, not just have an access method. So you have security around this data. You have the ability to encrypt the data. You have the ability to do, you know, both the simplest and the most scalable of functions against the data. No other database can do this. Nothing can do this like Informix, period. So did you know one of the largest makers of metadata management solutions in the world, called Ecologic Analytics, they are porting their application to Informix because of time series. Their existing application has hundreds of Oracle store procedures that they had to write to work around the issues with trying to store metadata management data, and they knew that it wasn't scaling. So they are porting in fact, they are completing their port now of their application. One of the largest airlines in the world uses embedded C-based user-defined routines to crunch through data to set fares. In fact, every day they load billions of rows of data on a 36-core box, 36-core CPU VP box to crank through this data. Almost every analyst firm on Wall Street uses Informix's time series with their own secret sauce routines, their own algorithms close to the data so they can analyze within milliseconds where they can find a way to make more money. And also one of the largest smart meter rollouts in the world taking place here in the United States at Encore is possible because of Informix's time series capability. And I think it's interesting because I would consider that in 2012, this to me is all of ours big data challenge. Big data to me is interesting if you want to go look at social media and figure out if the new Abraham Lincoln movie is going to be a hit for 20th Century Fox. But you know who cares about that? 20th Century Fox. The rest of us all have new sensors and data sources coming out there. In fact, I would challenge that the last couple of years, the single largest data explosion we're having going on in the world has nothing to do with people typing on a keyboard or any of us even creating pictures or videos. It's about smart meter data. It's about sensors on the side of our house feeding the utilities our electricity usage, or sensors on the top of a truck or fleet management so they have GPS data. In fact, I was working with a city in Colorado where they have it to where every police and car and fire truck has a GPS sensor on the top of it feeding data back to City Hall every 5 seconds, 24 hours a day. It never shuts off. And in fact, they're implementing that across their entire fleet of vehicles. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, every 5 seconds. You do the math, that's a lot of data. In fact, let's do some of the math. So if you look at sensor data, you know, let's look at here as I sit here in Minnesota, and right now there's a meter on the side of my house, and they do a meter read once a month. So the first row, 12 times a year. If they roll out a smart meter and they do meter reads every 15 minutes, that's 35,000 reads a year. With Encore, a customer I work with down in Texas, they're actually going to have commercial customers doing reads every 5 minutes. That's 105,000 records for that 1 meter every year. Or if you consider that I have sensors on the top of that car example I gave you, I said every 5 seconds. If it's every 10 seconds, that's 3 million database records. I'm rounding here for simplicity's sake. Every 5 seconds, that's over 6 million, 6.25 million records for every police car in this city, every fire truck in that city. Now, if I think about my smart meter example, or if I think about even a fleet management system, I have 100,000 of these things every 15 minutes. That is 3.5 billion database rows. Now, if you consider the fact that 100,000 meters on the side of a home equate to a community of about 200,000 people, that isn't a very big community, but that is a whole lot of data, ladies and gentlemen. So my case study here around this example, and I'm not sure if this applies to everyone on the phone or not, because I find that smart meters are becoming a use case that is creeping up on us. Whether it was that small city in Colorado who's trying to figure out how to deal with all this smart meter, or the fact that you're going to see more and more sensors coming into our homes that are feeding data back to somebody to help us either be smarter consumers or to figure out what we're doing. But at Encore, which is the utility there in North Texas, so if you look at that map on the right, the color-coded section is that, it is also one of the fastest-growing communities in the United States. People are moving to North Texas like there's no tomorrow, so it's a growing area. But right now it is about a 3.5 million meter rollout. And the mix there is 3 million residential, 500,000 business. And right now they're completing their rollout at 40,000 meters a week. You do the math, that is a lot of data. In fact, every 15-minute reads, that means they have 122 billion database rows a year if I did this in a traditional database. And they were having a problem. Their problem was the fact that they were doing inserts, millions of them, but they still had to read the data, so they were having I/O constraint issues. And they were also having the fact that as they were doing this, as they were growing their system, they ran out of hours in the day to actually get the data, cleanse the data, report on the data, you know, heaven forbid, run a utility bill out of the data. So they ran a benchmark with just 90 days of data for 1 million meters, and they had a problem. Let me get to the crux of the matter. Their problem was, as they were trying to load the data and report on the data, they were running out of hours in the day. And oh, by the way, it was going to consume a lot of space. So one of the things that I found with database technology that I think is a challenge for all of us is to try to quantify performance is hard. in terms of money saved. But if I'm thinking about where I can quantify savings, it's in how much less disk space do I need. So they found very quickly with Informix, it's using 1/3 of the disk space to crank through the data that much faster. And how do we do that? Well, if you haven't played with it yet, and by the way, all of you can with 1170 because it's immediately loaded in the database, is in a traditional database, you're doing insert, 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 insert. In fact, that's the way we would have all solved this problem, right? We're going to insert our eyeballs out into one big, growing, explosive table. And what happens is, and again, back to my Encore example, that means in 1 year I'm doing 122 billion inserts into a database table. And that's how you do it with really any other database, whether it's Oracle, SQL Server, MySQL, DB2, you pick it. With Informix, what you're doing is you have the data be a column type of time series. So when you do an insert, it's almost like the data is going to grow out to the right, like an array. So that means that for my 3.5 million customers, I'm going to have 3.5 million rows in my database, but that data type is going to grow to the right. So I'm not duplicating all the other key data. I'm not duplicating a lot of other data types like the timestamp of the data. I have a time series data type that's growing out to the right. That means that I can insert the data faster. That means I can read the data faster. And there's all kinds of functions within Informix to help you deal with missed data, dirty data, or functions you want to run against this time series data. Now, here's something that I think has gotten lost since the days of the TPC benchmarks. Everybody remember the TPC benchmark days? Back in the 90s when it was all about, you know, I'm 15% faster than you were last week on the same hardware. Well, we have a benchmark here. It's about a year old now. There's actually been newer ones that are bigger that actually show the same general changes. But in this particular use case, I am loading the data, doing something they called in the utility space of validation, estimation, and editing, and then finally billing the customers for the data. And I felt compelled to show results because I think they should give you an example both of what Informix can do as a database and what Informix can do differently when you apply it to this use case of needing to extend into time series data. And if you look at what I can do per second, what I can do per processor, what I can do per kilowatt hour, and I'm not going to go through the numbers. You can see it as well as I can. But it is astonishing. This isn't your typical 15% better. I am almost 10x better. I am 10x better in all kinds of ways. And oh, by the way, I'm doing it consuming 1/3 the storage, 66% less storage. In fact, the way Encore had the bean counters accept the decision for Informix was the fact that they figured, you know what, over a 5-year period, I'm going to use so much less storage it more than pays for itself. It was a no-brainer. And ladies and gentlemen, Encore only ran Oracle up to this point. They didn't have any Informix in their shop whatsoever. So it is a very game-changing story. In fact, I summarize it here as why not Informix? Well, I tell you what, this explosive big data source of sensor data, it's all about less storage. And oh, by the way, I can do it on a lot less expensive hardware as well. I can do it transparent to your application. We have this virtual table interface that I highlighted on a previous presentation slide here, and I didn't necessarily call it out. But this thing called the VTI that makes it where I can run my inserts and run my queries, and they look just the same, but I can run it against time series data. I can do it in an open relational environment. So I can do this whether it's on a small Linux box all the way up to the biggest of operating environments. I can do it up or down using an open relational structure. I can then extend my data to do other things like spatial. Within Encore, for instance, the where question, you know, is very easy to solve now because I have it in a time series. But you know what? Each meter has a latitude and longitude location. So I now have the ability to ask where questions and do it closest to the data. Again, back to Brad Jensen's quote from 12 years ago at the user conference where my ability to stop worrying about how I'm processing data and I can focus on my business logic is what makes this so powerful. And now I'm able to do this and be transparent to my development environment. Java.net, I can use whatever I want to ask these questions and bring the results back. And I have this ability in the base engine. So as I talked about Informix being smarter, well also Informix extending here is part of the base engine. So always safe, and we're coming to a close here. So again, I mentioned how early in the conversation here I had my identity stolen, and I suddenly found out there was a guy buying literally beer at a grocery store in Atlanta as Tom Rieger, and I didn't get to drink any of it, so I was very upset about that. But I had my credit card stolen, and I never really found out how or why, but I figured it had to relate to do with one of these encroachments, upon a disk at some clearinghouse or bank somewhere. So we all need to be very cognizant of how all of these things that I'm storing in my database, in terms of how it gets there, how I'm storing it, how I'm backing up, how I'm replicating it, is secure. So Informix has always had a very, very good auditing capability. They came out of organizations like the NSA and others in the government back in the 90s. It is still very much there for anyone to turn on and use today to keep track of who does what to the database. I have encryption, both at the disk level. I have encryption within the replication itself, the ability to capture incorrect passwords. I can control who and how somebody administers the database, and on and on and on. So Informix as a database is also very, very, very secure, no matter what I am using it for, no matter what hardware platform I am on. So, in summary, Informix has been around a long time, and it has evolved around all this ability of becoming something that is always what you need. And I mentioned it once, I'm going to mention it again. Why is it after all these years, databases are still such a pain in the rear end? Informix as a business is a growing business. In fact, I see it all the time where organizations are constantly needing more of it because it just runs so well. It runs so well because they allow their people in their IT organization to focus on the problems in their business and not the problems with the technology. So with that being said, I would always, recommend, if you don't believe me, go try it for yourself under the trials and demo versions of the database itself. There's a survey that was done a couple of years ago where a company called Vendor Ratings went out there and did a review of the marketplace and found that Informix was the most recommended and recommendable technology of anything in organization's stack. And this is even comparing it to things like operating systems and routers and switches. Even comparing it to SQL Server. Sometimes within IBM we like to talk about comparing everything to how Oracle is so wrong. But you know what? There's a lot more going on out there with technology, and Microsoft is one of those. And it's still amazing to me as SQL Server has moved from 2008 to 2012 and beyond, how the database itself is even more of a burden to maintain and not less of a burden to maintain. You like to hope with each iterative release of an application or of a technology, it would become easier for me to do more with. And by the way, I would be remiss if I did not put a little promotion in here for the IIUG conference. The call for speakers is still open, and you can attend for free if you are picked. So please make sure you go to the IIUG.org website. It is in San Diego, which, by the way, San Diego in April is not a bad place to go. So I wanted to highlight that as well to anybody on the presentation. So I'm hoping that you see from the last 54 minutes of our presentation, why not Informix? The marketplace out there, the V's are kind of just obvious to all of us, the variety, velocity, volume, and veracity of the data. But I think one thing that gets lost in here is the fact that IT budgets are flat or shrinking. So how do I do it for less? How do I get the value side of that in there? And I kind of played with my always on and fast, always smart, always flexible, always secure. As I say here at the end, it's about what I can do to make it where I'm doing more for my internal customers. So that is the end of the presentation. I will go ahead and end the recording now and go ahead and start taking questions. So if anyone has any questions, please enter those in the right-hand side of the screen, and I will take them one at a time, or you can direct them to my email address that you see here